day. Now I want to tell you about the Golden Boy's story. So, every August for 12 years, Chris' family always rented the same small house in the same small town near the same beach. Every day they did same activities. Like every day, Chris always woke up and walked down to the beach. Meanwhile, his father always sat on his deck chair and read a newspaper, and his mother always went for swimming. And every summer for 12 years, Chris only read his book and sometimes played volleyball with the others. And every August for 12 years, there was a same family sat next to them. They were called Hamiltons. Mr. and Mrs. Hamiltons had two sons, Richard and Philip. Richard and Philip were taller and more handsome than Chris, and Chris' mother liked Richard and Philip a lot. Chris' mother always compared Chris to Richard and Philip, and Chris' mother always said if everything about Richard and Philip were perfect, then everything about Chris. And one day, Richard and Philip held a barbecue party. They cooked a lot of food, and there was a big woman that always brought her bag with her. In that barbecue party, her name is Mrs. Moffat. Mrs. Moffat ate so many food in that barbecue party. She ate 3 plates of chicken and 2 hamburgers. And meanwhile, Chris only ate 1 hamburger and then left the barbecue party. And then because Mrs. Moffat ate so many food, she was sleepy and she went to her deck chair and then sleep. And when she woke up, she was screaming because she couldn't find her bag. Because of that, so many people in that beach came to see why was Mrs. Moffat screaming. And then Mrs. Moffat said if she lose her bag. At first, so many people didn't believe it because they thought if the beach was safe. And then because they heard Mrs. Moffat's story, so they helped Mrs. Moffat to look for her bag. And then suddenly, Chris' father found it in sand under the Richard and Philip's deck chair. And then directly, Chris' father gave it to Mrs. Moffat. And then Mrs. Moffat checked it and she couldn't find her purse on her bag. And then they called Richard and Philip, and they gave Richard and Philip a lot of questions. But Richard and Philip couldn't answer it because they didn't know what was happening. And then Mrs. Moffat called police, and also police gave Richard and Philip a lot of questions, but they still couldn't answer it. And then the police brought Richard and Philip to the police station. And meanwhile, Chris read his book and tried to hide a big and fat purse. And because of that, Chris' mother never compared Chris to Richard and Philip. I think that's all. Thank you.
Moral story.
So So I think the moral story is we can't compare our son with the others. And some parents, being parents is big were are being parents are not easy, and I think parents want to do best to their sons, but in the story, Chris' parents did like compare the son with others, and I think the parents thought in the story if they compared their son with the other, their son be will be better. I think that's all.